Today we're going to learn about data types and variables. So what's data? Data is basically information and it can come in various formats such as words, alphabets, special characters, numbers, and so on. So if you talk about images, images are also basically converted into number format and then it's going to be used by the computer. So data type then refers to the category of data that we're working with. So there are distinct categories of data types and some of them are listed here. First one is string, then integer, float, and boolean. So we're going to look into each of these categories now in the coming slides. So what is a string? A string is basically a combination of characters, and these characters could be alphabets, could be special characters, could be numbers, could be anything. The only defining item for a string is this quotation mark that you see. So there's no difference between a single quotation mark or a double quotation mark. Both of these refer to a string. But if you don't have this quotation mark, then it's not considered a string. So anything which is between two quotation marks is considered as a string data type. When we talk about integers, the common identifier is that it is any number which is positive or negative, or it could be zero. The only difference is that it doesn't have any sort of decimal attached to it, or it doesn't have any fractions to it. So it's only the numbers ranging from all the negative numbers to all the positive numbers without any decimal points. Float refers to those values which have decimal points, which is given here example. So you have positive decimal points, you have negative decimal points, and so on. So the identifier is basically this decimal point. The last data type that we're going to see here in this video is Boolean. So Boolean data type usually takes only two values, which is either a true or a false, a yes or a no. So for example, if you want to compare two numbers, you're going to be asking, is 5 greater than 6? So the answer is no. So those kind of situations, you'll use this Boolean data type. Next, we're moving on to what is called as variables. So variables are basically, you can imagine it like places where you can store information. So for example, imagine any locker where you're going to store information. So each of these boxes may contain different information, and these boxes may be at different locations. So you will need to give it specific name so that you will be able to identify this specific box, and then you will want to know what is the content inside the box. Similarly, in coding, variables store values, and then depending on what value the variables are storing, each variable will have its own data type, like the 4 types that we saw earlier, or other data types. So there are some naming conventions that we need to follow when we are naming these variables. So the first one is that you cannot start a variable name with a number. So you should always start with an alphabet, or you could start with an underscore. That's the only special character that's allowed to be part of your variable name. So yeah, that brings me to the second point. There's no special character which is allowed in variable names except this underscore. So this can be either at the beginning or it could be anywhere in any part of the variable name. So there's no space allowed. There are numbers allowed anywhere other than the first place. So you could have something like number 1 as a variable name, number 2 as a variable name. That's allowed. But number 1 followed by number is not allowed. So a good practice is to give meaningful names to your variables. So if you know what you're going to be storing inside that variable, it makes sense to give a name that is appropriate to that particular information that you're storing. So that way it's easier for other programmers or other people who are looking at your code to understand what's happening there. So let's say you're going to store the name of a person in a variable. Then it's logical to store it as either name or first name or given name or something like that, rather than just putting it as A equal to something or B equal to something. Okay. So meaningful names is something that we need to keep in mind. Let's now try to open an online Python compiler, and then let's try out whatever we learned just now. going to show you how to do the coding now. So what you can do is use one of the online compilers that are available. So I'm going to use REPL.it. So you could sign up and create an account for yourself so that you can save your files and then you can work on it if you're not able to spend enough time at one shot. So for now, I'm just going to start using it like this. So we talked about different data types and we talked about variables. So for example, I'm going to give a variable called num and I'm going to put equal to 10. So what I'm doing here is basically creating a variable called num, and the name is meaningful because num refers to a number. So, and the number that I'm storing here is 10. So let's say we want to just print out this number and see. So let's just print num and then look at the result. You notice that it says 10 is being stored inside this variable num. So now if I want to know what is the data type of this, there is this function called type that you can use. So print type num. So this will tell us that the data type of this particular variable num is an integer. The short form is int. Similarly, you can do a string. So for example, I can just say name equal to Alex. Okay. So here I want to now check the type of name and then run this. You notice that now it says it's a string. So we just learned that strings means it'll have a double quotation mark. So this is what I mean by meaningful names. So if I just give something like D equal to Martin. So for anybody who is new to the code, if they look at your code, they will not know what this D is actually referring to, because oftentimes the codes would be longer and then it might take a lot of effort to read someone else's code. So the least we could do is add in some comments or give names which are more meaningful, so it gives the overall picture of what you're trying to do. So what do I mean by comments? So in Python, comments are given by this hash symbol. So you notice the color changes to gray here. So this one I can say printing the value stored. Okay, so when I put something like this, the program will actually tell the user what we're trying to do there. So comments are usually good programming practices as well, just like good variable names. So variable names cannot start with numbers. So see what happens if I give a variable like this. Now I've given 3 num equal to 8. You notice the red line is there, so these compilers will be able to tell you when it is not correct. So it says invalid syntax. It's basically because it's starting with a 3. So let's just try to run this. You see, it just made the same error. Syntax error, invalid syntax, because variable names cannot start with the number 3. But you could put the number 3 behind, or you could put it anywhere else except the first location. Now you see there's no error, and then num3 has the value of 8 stored. So let's try starting with an underscore. Will this give me an error now? Let me shift back the 3 to the front, but I'm starting with an underscore this time. You notice that there's no error here. There's absolutely no problem with this one because we are starting with underscore. So let's run this. Again, it gives me that it's an integer. Number 8 is an integer. So let's try changing that to a float. And then you should be getting the value as float. Okay. So these are some naming conventions that you need to follow when you're using variables. So now try out some examples. So I've listed down some variables with values stored in them. We want to try to now identify if the variable names are correct, if they are meaningful, and also identify what is the data type of each of these variables. So the first one, age equal to 25. So what is the type of data that's being stored here? It's a string because you have quotation marks. It's a string. Okay, so let me just put down the data type here, string. And then whether it's meaningful, yes, 25 could be representing an age, just that the data type is a string instead of a number, which is all right. You can change it when you're doing your coding. So age equal to 25, so the data type here is string and the variable is age. Second one, cash equal to 23.5. So is this correct? Yes. The data type, you see that it has decimal point values, so then the data type is called as float. And whether it's meaningful, yes, cash could be having decimal values and it could represent cash. Height equal to 43. Again, it's meaningful. 43 is an integer, so the data type here is int. That's stored in height. So data type of height is int. Underscore food equal to banana. Whether it's meaningful, yes, banana is a type of food item, so probably it could be valid. And the data type of this is obviously string because of the quotation mark. And whether the variable name is correct, you notice that it's starting with an underscore, which is acceptable. There, it's not starting with a number, and it's meaningful, so you can, this one has no problem. Next one, cash dollar equal to 100. So if you look at this one, we learned that for variables it cannot have any special characters other than an underscore. So this one has a dollar sign, which is not acceptable. So if you try to do that, it's going to throw an error back. So this is not correct. So it will give you an error. You can't have the dollar sign. Then animal equal to dog. So in this case, it's a bit tricky because this one doesn't have a quotation mark, if you see, compared to this banana here, which means that the computer is not going to recognize dog as a string here. Instead, it's going to recognize dog as a variable. But we have not declared any variable called dog here, so it's going to give you an error in that case. So for now, I'm just going to take it as an error because there is no dog variable we have defined here. Okay. Then choice equal to true. Yes, this is valid, and the data type is going to be Boolean because it's talking about true or false. Then the next one is fav food equal to noodles. So you notice that there's only underscore which is allowed, and fav food is meaningful, and you're storing a string there. So the data type of this is going to be a string. Then the last example here is 3 underscore number equal to 35. Yes, 35 is a number, it's an integer. However, this is going to give you an error because it's starting with a number which is not allowed. So this is going to be an error. So I hope with this that you would have some clarity on how to name variables in Python and how to identify the data types of the different variables that you might come across. I'll see you in the next video where we will talk about input and output statements in Python.